Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Lieutenant General Manoj Kumar Katyar, PVSM, AVSM, General Officer Commanding in Chief, Western Command, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Chanakya Niti seminar. We are especially grateful to the 4 scholars who've agreed to share their knowledge and perspectives. And we are equally grateful to the veterans who are gracing today's event with their presence. I now invite Major General Neeraj Bali, Sena Medal, retired, Director of Gyan Chakra Think Tank, to initiate the proceedings with his introductory remarks.
Good morning. Senior veterans, esteemed guests, serving officers, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this very special seminar on one of India's most remarkable thinkers, Acharya Chanakya, also known by his pen name Kautilya, or by his birth name Vishnugupta. Now, I must admit up front that I'm not remotely a Chanakya scholar. Like many of you, I'm just a curious mind who's been drawn to this today's unique event to learn about Chanakya's razor-sharp intellect, fearless statecraft, and timeless wisdom. And in pursuit of this slice of learning, we are in the hands of 4 leading scholars on the subject. Today, you will benefit from the knowledge and perspective of these eminent speakers in the following sequence: Dr. Radhakrishnan Pillai, Dr. Kajri Kamal, Mr. Pranav Patel, and Professor Upinder Singh. Last week, Dr. Pillai shared a video of US Army College where Chanakya's philosophy was being taught to senior US military officers. Now, a few of you moments ago might have seen excerpts of that video which we had put up while we were settling down. This video is a remarkable revelation that in the US military circles, indeed in the West, Chanakya is being hailed as a greater mind than Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and Clausewitz, people who we quote ad infinitum when we have our discussions. In that lecture, the professor quoted an influential German sociologist, Max Weber, and he said this about Chanakya, and I'm going to read his quote. He said, "Most of us in this room grew up believing that Machiavelli was the original intellectual on statecraft. After all, he wrote The Prince and The Art of War. By the way, one Art of War was written by Sun Tzu, the other one by Machiavelli. Still, in many respects, compared to Arthashastra, Machiavelli's Prince was harmless. Arthashastra is the pure distillation of statecraft. Chanakya tells you things you don't want to even think about, even in your nightmares, that a ruler has to do to achieve the interest of his state." Now, that description itself certainly tells us that it's time we paid greater attention to this homegrown intellectual giant. Let's be honest. Any man who could defeat the mighty Nandas at the height of their powers, install a young boy called Chandragupta as an emperor, and pen a 6,000-verse manual on statecraft, economics, and espionage, all the while staying in a hut, deserves more than our academic curiosity and admiration. He deserves a deep, thoughtful conversation, and that is what today's seminar is all about. Now, before I leave the stage for our esteemed scholars, let me recount a brief story about Chanakya's realpolitik and his understanding of strategy. This is a story that tells us that Chanakya believed that good strategy is often more important than sheer brute force. Chanakya and Chandragupta Maurya had launched a campaign against the powerful Nanda dynasty. According to several historical and traditional sources, their initial direct attack on the heart of Magध was unsuccessful, and they failed to take the Nanda capital, Patliputra. The main reason for this failure was a strategic miscalculation. Instead of gradually conquering the outlying regions and building support, they had attempted to seize the capital directly, which led to their forces being surrounded and defeated by the Nanda army. Now, in the midst of all these failed attempts, Chanakya happened to overhear a mother who was scolding her child over trying to eat a roti that was too hot. The mother was saying, "Why do you eat from the center of the hot roti? Start from the edges." To Chanakya, that one fleeting routine sentence gave a lesson in strategy. Chanakya's conclusion was, don't attack the center first. Conquer the edges, gain strength, and then move to the heart of the kingdom. It was a masterclass in strategy derived from an overheard kitchen conversation. That is just a glimpse into how observant and sharp-minded Chanakya was. I wish to thank the Army Commander for envisioning this unique seminar that will surely inspire many of us to examine the wisdom of our own roots and arguably and perhaps delve deeper to imbibe a strategic culture. Thank you and Jai Hind.
It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Radhakrishnan Pillai, the founder and director of Chanakya International Institute of Leadership Studies at the University of Mumbai. He is the foremost expert on Chanakya's wisdom and has delivered over 1,000 lectures in institutes like NDC, DSSC, RBI, and BSc, etc. He is also the author of several books on Chanakya, including Inside Chanakya's Mind. May I now request Dr. Radhakrishnan Pillai to speak on Chanakya, the scholar, his leadership philosophy, and relevance in governance and geopolitics. Dr. Pillai, please.
Can you have the PPT? Can you have my PPT, please? Yeah, thank you. Respected Army Commandant, military officers, scholars, and my dear friends. Let me start with a story. Ustad Bismillah Khan met a young practitioner of music और हिंदी में उन्होंने पूछा क्या आता है तुम्हें गुरु पूछते हैं ना ज़्यादा नहीं आता 4 राग याद आता है प्रैक्टिस 4 रागास अच्छा तुम्हें 4 राग आता है For last 30 years, I've been practicing my instrument, my music. I only have tried to perfect 1 raga. और कुछ नहीं आता चाणक्य आता है. So in the next 20 minutes that I have, I'm going to try and give some insights into Chanakya. And this insights maybe should help all of us after this seminar to maybe study it further. वो ना खाना अभी बाकी है. A lot of scholars here. But if we can start with a curiosity to understand Chanakya. I'm sharing with sir also. The US military is teaching it. A lot of other universities and countries are teaching it. That's only one example. Our friendly neighbors are also doing it. Yet, what's important is that don't just study Chanakya, get insights about Chanakya. Because as scholars, we have this problem, and that includes me. We like to publish books, I've done a lot of work, and we should. Yet, when it comes to application, it's an interesting way. Therefore, in the next few minutes, I'm trying to get inside Chanakya's mind the way I have understood it and discovering Chanakya Niti and his intelligence. So let me start with a question. I'm sure everybody in the hall has at least heard about Chanakya. India mein to, you have to hear the name at least. Kya kiya, that's a different story. Which is that one word that you associate with Chanakya? Many words, this is put on Google and all, and then suddenly you find so many versions. By the way, there are many versions of Chanakya which is not put into it. One of them is metallurgist. Metallurgist. And military scientist. There is a warfare expert, military scientist. I have not used many words, but which is that one word that you associate when you hear the word Chanakya? Closest to your heart. And all the answers are correct, by the way. Pardon? Strategist. Statesman, political thinker, many of them are missing, by the way. So one person, multiple dimensions. And the one word I would come close to, apart from strategist, I love the word strategist, is called, he is a polymath. Who is a polymath? A person who knows about multiple disciplines and knows how to connect them or disconnect them. So a person who has actually written in one book 180 topics. Anyway, he's a scholar that we can go on, and we have the other scholars who will be speaking also. But what I'm going to do is leave you with some curiosity. I've written 24 books on Chanakya and writing 4 more. But for this group, I would recommend 2 books. I'm sure many of you must have read it. The most famous for military officers is Chanakya and the Art of War, published by Penguin. It's available. And since Sun Tzu and the Art of War, so we have a Chanakya and Art of War. But this is one book I would recommend, Inside Chanakya's Mind, Anvikshiki and the Art of Thinking. Again, Penguin. So very much available wherever you want, Amazon or whatever. Now this book actually gives some insights the way I have understood Chanakya. And what I'm going to do, complete the whole lecture in one slide. Because we can go on and on, because this is one subject that is fascinating, yet it's also real. So my slide consists of, looking at some concepts of Chanakya in the next 15 minutes that I have. So as far as leadership is concerned, I would say we have to understand that one of the major concepts of Chanakya, I would say it's like fundamental foundation, is Anvikshiki. How many of you heard the word? One person. It's like ABC of Chanakya. Hindi में बोले तो सोचना कैसे है? There is a great teacher, again part of Mumbai University, R.P. Kangle. He translated Arthashastra also. There are many scholars who have worked, but his translation of Anvikshiki in English was philosophy. That's why I call him philosopher, right? But I say Anvikshiki, my translation is a science of strategic thinking. Science. And science has to be logical, right? So if I have to use a Sanskrit word defining Arthashastra, he says Anvikshiki is the Prathama Vidya for a leader. Prathama, first. And Prathama also means ultimate. शुरू कीजिए सोचने से और अंत कीजिए सोचने का. So if you know how to think correctly. So the technical words are Sankhya Yoga Lokayata iti Anvikshiki. Sankhya, it's a philosophy. We have Shad Darshanas in Indian culture. And Sankhya is one of the philosophies, Bhagavad Gita chapter 2, Sankhya Yoga. But here we look at numbers, Sankhya. If you don't have data, you cannot be a strategist. Even in the corporate world we say, don't give me ideas, come with the data and numbers, and let's discuss an action plan. So Sankhya Yoga. Of course, today we look at Yogasanas, but it's a philosophy also. Patanjali and many others have worked on it, yet yoga here means a strategist has to be calm and quiet. Because sometimes numbers can be dangerous, right? Look at what's happening in US. 27%, I don't know, 40%, 50%. Shantro. Lokayata. What's your action plan? Leaders cannot be only thinkers. Thinking is important, but what's your action plan? So when you look at this model, it's a very interesting model of practical application. So in the previous slide, you must have seen one of the way people look at Chanakya is that he's a realist. कैसे होना चाहिए और कैसे होता है, इसमें जमीन आसमान का फर्क है. Many times we live in a utopian world of this should be like that. But the reality is different, right? Ground reality. So start from realistic world to create a better world. So that's Anvikshiki. Of course, the books are there. A lot of articles have been there. And Anvikshiki is becoming very prominent. But unfortunately, a word that we have lost. And let me tell you, this is not a word invented by Chanakya. It existed before him. In fact, Acharya Bhishmacharya in Mahabharata has a complete lecture on Anvikshiki. Again, referring to military strategy. So let me come to the next word, leadership. I'm sure leadership seminars keep happening across the world. It's a very popular subject, even in academics. So management has become leadership as a buzzword now. 3 words that Chanakya uses in Arthashastra relating to leadership. Swami, Rajarishi and Vijigishu. There's one more word prominent in Indian culture defining leadership in Sanskrit. and that is surprisingly pati. Heard the word pati? If I ask a common person, what is the translation of pati? Husband, right? That's the common narrative. But pati actually means leader. Ganapati, Ganon ka pati. Senapati, Rashtrapati. Chanakya doesn't use pati, he does use, but prominently these three words. And what's the narratives that he uses? Swami. It's a part of a very prominent, I would say, theory or a framework in military strategy or a strategy of a kingdom in statecraft called as Saptanga, which Pranav sir will be covering as we go ahead. Swami Amatya Janapada Durga Kosha Danda Mitra Itra Prakriteya. Swami means the leader, and leadership is Swamitva. Each person sitting here is a Swami or Swamini. But Raja Rishi is an ideal Swami. Philosopher king, Raja plus Rishi. So Socrates is known for this word philosopher king. Yet Raja Rishi is a very prominent word. Creation of a leader according to Arthashastra is actually creating of a Raja Rishi. There's chapters in the Arthashastra. Book number 1, Vinayadi Karikam, covers a chapter on creation of a Raja Rishi. That's why in our country, the word dharma is very prominent, right? Dharma is not just duty, it's also philosophy. So Raja Rishi. The third one, which again not popular in our generation, is Vijigishu. Anybody has heard this word? One who wants to be a world conqueror. Huh? We never attacked. We let others attack us. Vijigishu here is the one who aims to be a world conqueror. And I always say conquering doesn't mean killing. And if you play the game, better be number 1. Let's take cricket as a game. If you go and play the game of cricket, is it wrong to think that I want to win the World Cup? You better go and win it and come. Gully cricket ki baat nahi hai. So Vijigishu is a very interesting word that all of us should study. Of course, from a Chanakya angle, there's a lot of military component to it. Yet, there's a statistical narration to this. How do you do it? I'll give you a simple example. Let me ask you a question. How many countries officially play cricket? Any idea? More than 120 countries. Huh? What we see is that how many of them actually go to World Cup, isn't it true? So we said 10, 12, and IPL there are some 10 teams, but in the World Cup 10 to 12 team plays. But that doesn't mean they are the only country playing cricket. Thanks to the British who spread the whole thing. And interestingly, West Indies is not even a country, if you remember. So among hundreds of people, a few of them qualified to become a part of the World Cup. And among those 10, maybe 4 of them will reach what is called semi-finals. Out of that, 2 of them will reach finals. And then 1 person will win the cup, right? So you see the progression from many to a few, and from few to a lesser number and 1. Now Chanakya talks about this in Vijigishu, statistically. And it's a number game. So that's one thing. And I would suggest that, when we look at any particular operation, if you have data in mind, then you can look at, in the game of chess, it's very interesting, both the teams have the same numbers, isn't it? Yet your strategy is beyond numbers, but strategy starts with numbers. So Vijigishu, a lot of materials available on the internet on Vijigishu. The third and the last point is international relations. You heard about this word Mandala Yoni? I'm giving you checkpoints. Mandala Yoni is circle of kings. We're just talking about L.N. Rangarajan, who was a great expert of Chanakya. He's written a book also, again Penguin. Here is an exercise I generally do with my students. And I tell them, take a piece of paper and draw leadership in the form of an image, geometrical image, leadership. And usually 2 of them prominently comes out. One is a pyramid, right? And the leader is sitting on the top. That's a hierarchical structure. The other one is like a line and the leader is in the front, right? Here is a very interesting thing. The leadership of Chanakya is circle, mandala, and the leader is in the center. Imagine a honeycomb, beehive. So everything operates around the leader. And there's a funny thing. If you can recognize who's a leader, actually the team has lost. Can't the vice captain become the captain? And the captain can go and become a common man again? A leader should be very unassuming. Of course, visually we have applets, we have ranks, and that is also important. We have designations. Yet, he is the center of the whole activity. And the center is not just visual, it's also thought leadership. I'll just stop here by some other concepts. Saptanga, which will be covered. How many of you heard about Samadana Bheda Danda? सुना है सबने? चाणक्य सामधान भेद दंड. Sorry. There is Sapta Upaya. So we know 4 popular narratives, there are 3 more. I'll just quote them. And they are very important because we don't know beyond this. Upayas means solutions. Take any situation and Chanakya gives you 7 solutions. 4 are popular. Samadhana, Danda, Bheda. Then there are 3 more. I'll keep one secret so you can research. But there is something called Maya. And there is something called as Indriya Jal. You heard about the magician called PC Soccer? He's known for the Indriya Jal. It's a solution. It's a deceptive model. And that's where the Kautilya's next level comes in. And it's good it is not in popular narrative. But there are 7 upayas. Then Amatya Utpatti. A leader is the one who creates more leaders, not followers. So how do you create? How do you select leaders? How do you attract people for leadership? Training them. And of course, Shadgunya. This is very popular again in military literature, the Shadgunya. So I will just thought, I'll just show you some ideas. Lot of work has been written, videos are there. But let's stop here because of the time limitation, got 20 minutes. This is my favorite quote from Arthashastra. One arrow may or may not kill the enemy, but a man using his sharpened intellect can destroy the king along with his whole kingdom. So it is not intellect alone, huh? It is sharpened intellect. You may have a razor, but you have to sharpen it, right? Stephen Covey put it very nicely. Sharpening the saw. So seminars like this, your own study of, intellectual work by scholars, military history, will sharpen your intellect. So here it what it says, king can destroy. I like to stop with a story here. Since you stop with a story, sir, I got inspired. There's a very famous story about the Roman Empire collapse. There are a lot of theories around it, but one of the theories which attracted me and I connected to Chanakya was the theory of metals. Lead, if you remember. So lead was a prominent thing. How did Chanakya destroy Dhananand? There are many stories around it. Again, I'm not a historian. We have a ma'am here who will give more into history insights. It is said that he actually knew what is today's popular word called alchemy. So you can actually bring in 2 metals. And he was the one person who started the coinage system in India. There is a term called Pana, Suvarna, silver. So using that economic model of a new currency using metals, he actually eliminated a whole kingdom. I always say this, Chanakya was not a king. He did not have his own army. Yet he could defeat one of the greatest warriors, not only inside but also outside. Remember Alexander coming? There's a story around that also. Therefore, I like to say, sharpen your intellect using Anvikshiki or any of the theories, and we'll come back better than what we found our country. Thank you.
It's my honor to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Kajri Kamal, who will speak on relevance of Chanakya's diplomacy, statecraft, and neighborhood. Dr. Kajri Kamal is the author of Kautilya, the Arthashastra. She is an associate professor at Takshila Institute, Bangalore, and her research focuses on the concept of strategic culture in the Indian context. She is a regular invitee to premier defense institutes. I now request Dr. Kamal to address the audience. Thank you.
Respected Army Commander, Western Command, General Katyar, General Malik, other distinguished members of the audience, the very eminent co-speakers that I have sharing the stage with me today. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon, still morning. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Western Command and Gyan Chakra think tank for giving me this opportunity to present to you all my thoughts on the relevance of Kautilya's Arthashastra in contemporary geopolitics. This is the agenda that I'm going to follow for the next 20 minutes, and I hope to finish it before that. I begin with the question, why Arthashastra? And as you all know, Arthashastra is a treatise written by Kautilya, and I'm not going to go into the details of that. But thereafter, I divide my talk into two broad sections. The first will delve into some of the key theoretical concepts of the treatise, which I think is important to understand, for you to really appreciate the relevance which I hope to chart out in the next section. As they say, the proof of the pudding is in its eating. So unless I show you some of the concepts playing out in the real world, in contemporary India's foreign policy making, I will not be able to establish the relevance of Kautilya. And here I'll dig into India's relations with the United States, China, Pakistan, and the neighborhood. Why the Arthashastra? There are a whole gamut of texts and treatises in India's civilizational history which speak on the subject of warfare, kingship, strategy, governance, administration, right? Why the Arthashastra? It's important for 4 reasons, and I'm going to be using a geopolitical lens to whatever I say here. So just keep that in mind. I'm not going to be telling you about everything comprehensively, but I'm going to use the geopolitical lens because of the time limit. The very first reason, and I want you to appreciate the length and breadth of the modern empire and the map given at the end of the slide, it was for the very first time that there ever existed a cohesive Indian geocultural space with the desire to establish a pan-Indian empire encompassing it. And it is in this political context that the Arthashastra is written. The closest we've come to this is modern Indian nation state, territorially, right? Second very important reason, this text is not written in isolation. The very first sutra says that it's a compilation of a previous Artha tradition. It does have antecedent inclusion of wisdom from antecedent texts, and is also an inspiration to the texts which follow, right? Third, the breadth and comprehensiveness of the text. So at one end, it is a magnum opus on grand strategy, and at the other, it fleshes out every detail of military tactics. So it covers the entire spectrum. And the fourth, and I'm going to use Professor Singh's words here, it injects a very strong dose of pragmatic reason to the discourse on political discourse on kingship, right? And that is why this text is pivotal. It does identify what and details very meticulously what can be seen as a political economic approach to statecraft, which I think is extremely relevant when you're looking at it from a geopolitical perspective, something that I'm going to come to in a later slide. I'm sorry, my slides are not working the way they should be. Okay. So I'll get into the theoretical concepts first, and I'm going to take up Yogakshema. Yogakshema is a term which is used as the political end goal. Kautilya uses the term Yogakshema. It's a combination sandhi word of yoga and kshema, yoga meaning conquest, acquisition, kshema meaning consolidation, right? And that's how the stitching up of the modern empire perhaps was conceptualized, that you expand, you consolidate, you expand again, and the territorial limits of this expansion was limited to what Kautilya calls the Chakravarti Kshetra, which is the region of the sovereign, and it is identified in the book precisely as south of the Himalayas, north of the seas, 1,000 yojanas west to east. All right? Now, what is the political economic approach and what is the framework of statecraft? And this I'm going to explain from a very layperson's perspective. We're talking about a monarchy here, right? When you talk about the Arthashastra, he's talking about a monarchical form of government. So there is a Swami or the ruler. He is supposed to, through his duties of kingship, which is Rajadharma, acquire, protect, consolidate, augment land, which is called Arth. Arthashastra, Arth means this, the land inhabited by human beings, and make it available to his people. Why is that important? Because they need to provide for their livelihood. 2,300 years ago, which is presumably the time the text was written, if you needed to engage in gainful economic production, it had to emanate from land, agriculture, cattle rearing, forest produce, mining. So the ruler was supposed to, as his primary job, make livelihood available to his people. And that he could only do by provision, security, conquest, and consolidation of land. Since it's a monarchy, political legitimacy is critical. So the people, because they were happy with their roti, kapda, makan needs being met, they lent legitimacy back to the ruler and also paid taxes to the state, right? Because the state treasury, which is called kosh, was aflush with funds, the armed might of the state was strengthened, right? Only if you have funds can you hone your army. And because the armed might was strengthened, the ruler was able to curb Matsya Nyaya, which is the law of the fish. I think we should all be aware of what it means. In the absence of a central authority, the stronger power devours the weaker. So with this strengthened rod, the ruler was able to curb Matsya Nyaya in the domestic realm and was able to wield the rod more effectively in the interstate realm. Why did he need to do that? Because he needed to provide, acquire, conquer land to give it to his people, right? Now, through a loop of all these activities, what Kautilya ended up achieving was Yogakshema, which essentially is bringing about security, raksha, and welfare palan for his people. Two quick takeaways from this slide. Security and palan are interrelated goals. Only if you have security can you have welfare, only if you have welfare can you have security. That is the political economic approach, the integration of economics on one side and political science on the other. Only if you provide land can you have welfare, because of which the state treasury will be aflush with funds, and only if the state treasury is aflush with funds, your dand will be honed and therefore you can wield the rod more effectively. It's all interconnected. Second important takeaway, the internal domestic realm is innately interconnected to the interstate. You cannot talk about foreign policy in isolation. You cannot talk about internal security in isolation. The two are intrinsically connected. This is something which my colleague here, Mr. Pranav, will speak in more detail, so I won't elaborate. I'll just look at this perspective of power, state power, from a geopolitical angle, right? So Kautilya says that Sapt Ang is 7 organs of the body politic. They are in a hierarchical order, the way they're put on the slide. Importantly, there is a generative principle between them. What is that? The Swami appoints the ministers make sure there are successful undertakings in the Janpad, because of which there's a certain defensiveness of the state, because of which the treasury is aflush with funds, because of which the army is well honed, because of which the reliance on the external state factor ally is either redundant or the bargaining power with which you engage with your ally in the interstate realm is strengthened, right? 3 to 4 important takeaways from a geopolitical perspective. First, the most critical element of state power is not your economy, it's not your military might. What is it, which Sir alluded to? Anvikshiki. It's your power to take the right decision based on information. Knowledge is the bedrock of statecraft for Kautilya, right? Second, Durg comes before Dand. You'd rather protect your capital city than make acquisitions abroad. If the internal house is not in order, Kautilya would never advise to march outwards. There are first 6 are internal state factors. So Kautilya says that internal balancing is preferable, but in case you're not able to achieve your political interests because of your first 6 constituent elements not being in their optimum levels, you can rely on the external ally called the Mitra. Now this external factor is to be resorted to last, and that's why it's mentioned last, but it does mean that you have access to the ally. And he advises great amount of caution, especially when you're getting into a partnership with an ally who is much stronger than you, alluding perhaps to the principles of what we understand today in contemporary jargon, strategic autonomy. This is the Mandal Yoni, I like to call it the Rajamandala, and I have not put it in the concentric circles that we usually imagine the Rajamandala to be. Right? Rajamandala is concentric circles of states radiating outwards, the center being Vijigishu, who is the potential conqueror, and is the fulcrum of the interstate realm. That is because, and I've chosen this is also from L.N. Rangarajan, the direction of conquest is extremely important of the Vijigishu. The Vijigishu is at the center, so there are 12 categories of states that Kautilya talks about. Roughly 10 are co-equal in size. The ones in yellow and white are the co-equal ones. I'm sorry, the colors are also distorted in my slide, so the legend is also not quite correct. So if the Vijigishu is making a march to the north, the territory immediately proximate to that of the Vijigishu becomes that of the Ari. The one in the rear becomes Parshni Grey or the heel catcher, and alternate patterns of friend and foe happen both in the rear and in the front. The two more important categories of states that Kautilya talks about, which is one, the middle kingdom or the Madhyam. Madhyam sits abutting the territories of the Vijigishu and Dari. It is much bigger, as you can make out from the diagram, than the combined powers of the Vijigishu and Dari, and harbors the intention to keep the Vijigishu and Ari either united or disunited as its own political interest may demand. So, I mean, just to give you a hypothetical example, if India is the Vijigishu and potentially Ari, and if here we're still considering Pakistan as the Ari, then perhaps China is the quintessential Madhyam, right? There is another category called the Udasina that you're seeing sit somewhere outside. This person sits somewhere outside, not in the thick of the Rajamandala. It's much bigger than the Vijigishu, Ari, and the Madhyam put together. And also, although the term itself, Udasana, means neutral, but it can have a stake in the goings on and can keep the Vijigishu, Ari, Madhyam united or disunited. So intention of the categories of states is extremely important. How are states categorized? As you have figured out from the previous slide, geography, relative strength, and the intention of the state. And how do things work in the Rajamandala? Exactly like the interstate system that we inhabit today, which is that every state is trying to move up the cycle of advancement, increase its comprehensive national power, increase its relative strength vis-a-vis other states in the Rajamandala, and that relative strength becomes the basis on which foreign policy is pre-selected, if not predetermined. The Shadgunyas, briefly alluded to in the previous presentation, these are the 6 measures of foreign policy. Kautilya is very sure they are no more and no less than these 6. So there is Sandhi, which is peacemaking. It is invoked when the rival state is stronger. So see, the invocation of each of these measures of foreign policy is based on a particular strategic context, which is derived from the relative strength that you enjoy vis-a-vis the others in the Rajamandala. Hostility, which is going to war, is when you are when the rival state is vastly inferior. Obviously, then you can do a winnable war. Remaining quiet is when the correlation of forces is balanced. Marching, which is akin to coercive diplomacy, is when your own power is rising faster than the rival states. Seeking shelter is when you feel an imminent threat, you bandwagon with a bigger power, much bigger than the power you're feeling threatened from. And dual policy, which is you decide you have a policy of peace with state A so that you can do a policy of peace war with state B. Now, Kautilya does not hierarchize them. He doesn't say that this is preferable to the other because the strategic context is unique. But he does compare the merits of these measures of foreign policy. So if the outcome is the same, Kautilya says go for peace rather than war. In pursuing peace and war, if you're coming to the same outcome, you will go for peace rather than war. Why? The political economic approach. Wars cause share, vyay, pravas, losses, expenses, and demoralization of the army, right? Especially when they engaged in long hauls. Between remaining quiet and yana, he prefers asan. Between samshray and dvedabhav, he prefers dvedabhav. Why does he prefer dvedabhav? Because in samshray, you're submitting yourself to a larger enemy, obviously making yourself vulnerable to the dictates of the enemy, to the country that you're seeking shelter from. Again, a very vibrant element of strategic autonomy. The upayas, we've spoken about this, I'm not going to waste time here. But I just want to tell you, while the upayas are not novel to the Arthashastra, what's novel is the ways in which the upayas can be used. So there is exclusive use, which is you use only sam, you use only dan, only bhed, only dand, in that order, forced to be used as a last resort. You can have an alternate use. So you have a sam and dan, go to bhed dand, come back to sam and dan. The next time you come to sam and dan, it will be much more effective because of your show of bhed and dand. And the last is a combination which, according to Kautilya, is the most potent, that you have sam, dan, bhed, dand employed simultaneously to get the adversary to do what you would want it to do. There is a treatment of allies. There's a whole, I could go on for an hour about how the allies have to be dealt with, but very briefly, when you're looking for an ally in the interstate realm, these are the qualities you look for. It should be constant, under control, extremely important. You'd rather have a small ally giving you small help, but it should be under your control. You should not be under the control of the person you're seeking help from. Quickly mobilizing, hereditary, strong, and not prone to double dealing. And what are the strategies for different allies? Remember, when Kautilya proposes making allies in the interstate realm, it's not out of benevolence, it's out of strategic reason. And you are then ultimately also going to outmaneuver your own ally. The concept of ati samdhana, right? So what do? So if there's an ally who identifies with you, you increase its power. If there's an ally who is likely to grow in power, you embroil him in conflict. If there's a weak ally, you maintain its strength. And if there's an ally in a calamity, you help him come up himself, right? Slides are back in order. The next section is on the relevance. I'm going to begin with India and the United States. Now, I don't obviously hope that you'll remember all of what I said, so I'm going to repeat some bits of what I said just to put things in context. The United States fits as a quintessential Udasana in India's Rajamandala. It sits somewhere outside, it is much bigger. Well, that's questionable, but yes, still much bigger. And has the intention to keep the Vijayagishu, Ari and Madhyam united or divided. Who are the Vijayagishu, Aris and Madhyams in India's Rajamandala? Considering hypothetically India is the Vijayagishu, Ari maybe both Pakistan and China, and Madhyam of course China because of its position and strength. But what India has tried to do with the United States, and this is specific to the timeline mentioned on the slide, is make the United States its mitra, the last component of state power. And why did India need to befriend or make the United States its mitra? For affordable energy supply, for, I think the India-US civilian nuclear deal was extremely beneficial for India, and of course to check the assertive rise of China in the region. Right? So it's tried to get into what Kautilya would call a somewhere or a strategic partnership with the United States. Now, Kautilya would say that when you get into a strategic partnership, make sure that the relative strength is somewhat equal, or you're getting into a partnership with a weaker, but here US is a much stronger power. So what you need to then look for is complete convergence of interests. So the three factors is strength, that your partner should give you strength, which the US perhaps is, that there should be complete convergence of interests, and we have to make sure that there is, and from that flows reliability. So if there is a complete convergence of interest, even the stronger partner in the relationship can give you the gains you're looking for from that somewhere or strategic partnership. Additionally, what India has tried to do is not put all the eggs in the US basket. We know for a fact that India has a strategic global partnership with Japan, a special privileged partnership with Russia, and several other bilateral, multilateral partnerships that we have with the rest of the world with like-minded partners. So we've tried to then tread this very tightrope walk between maximizing our interests from our partnership with the United States without giving up on strategic autonomy. And therefore, we have what we call an entente and not an alliance. Now, this is something which is completely baffling for the Americans because they cannot see shades of grays in relationship. And this is where the nuance of Arthashastra comes in. That, well, you can have a partner, but I'm not submitting to, I'm not an ally partner the way the US understands a Japan or an Australia or a Canada. Okay, let's take India, China. Now, this is where the beauty of relative strength impacting the trajectory of bilateral relations really comes alive. So we have the 1990s, where both India and China are relatively co-equal powers. So they enter into what Kautilya would call a samdhi, which is a pact of non-aggression. The border peace and tranquility agreements of 93 and 96 are exactly samdhis in the way Kautilya understands them. Both did this because they had set themselves on the path of economic reforms. They wanted to maintain peace on the border to consolidate their domestic capacities. In the next couple of decades, China consolidated its capacities much better than India did and rose to become the Rajamandala's Madhyam. All right? Madhyam again, territorial proximity with Vijayagishu Ari, much bigger, and the intention to keep Vijayagishu and Ari divided. So what did India do with China for most of this twin-decade period? Walking on two legs, which incidentally is a Chinese proverb, where we managed our convergences and divergences. We tried to maintain border peace at the border, economically engaged with China, even though the balance of trade was tipping in favor of China. We also participated in multilateral fora with China. We continue to do that, and also simultaneously militarily prepare. The next switch happened, I think, in the year 2020 with what happened in Ladakh in the summer of 2020. China was demonstrably an enemy. So it was showing an inimical disposition as well and came to become what Kautilya would call a contingent enemy. Now there's a difference. So when you call someone an Ari or an ally, according to Kautilya, there are various shades in it. There is one who's a zero-sum natural innate enemy, but there's one who's enemy for the time being, for structural reasons, right? China is that enemy for the time being. And what Kautilya thought China has done is, a policy switch. Now the 6 measures of foreign policy are not cast in stone. You're supposed to very, very effectively pivot from one to the other, causing the maximum political interest to your own state. So what China has ended up doing is moved from Samdhi, pact of non-aggression, to Yana, which is coercive diplomacy, the term being Samdhiyayana. And why would China do that? Kautilya reasons. He says that if a bigger power is allied in a pact of non-aggression with a smaller power, he will continue to do it only when the smaller power remains subservient. So when the smaller power is also trying to fervently fill the gap, the smaller power is also showing resuscitation of Quad, leaning towards the United States, border road infrastructure development. There are no signs from India showing that they are the subservient power in the relationship. So the strategic advantage was obviously on China's side, and they also saw this behavior from India. Now, what are the options for India? Flexible response. Kautilya says, imaginatively use the spectrum between foolhardy valor, calling China out as an enemy and fighting it, and spineless submission. Pakistan, the challenge is complex, but the framework is simple. So Pakistan is that innate enemy. If you've read the External Affairs Minister's book, The India Way, he's called it, he has actually referred to it as the Trigarta warriors of the Mahabharata, unifocal enemies. They just focused on defying India. Their identity is anti-India, right? So they are the innate enemy, and therefore, I think what India has tried to do with Pakistan as an enemy is move along these 4 pivots. I'm not going to go into it. I think all of you are well abreast with our means to conciliate, compensate, cause dissension, and fight war when needed to. The neighborhood. To me, it's the trickiest, but also the most underrated foreign policy challenge for India. I think India cannot ever hope to have a global presence unless it manages its neighborhood. And the problem in the neighborhood, and if you see it from a Kautilyan perspective, is that of asymmetry and proximity. So India is the preponderant power in the Indian political subcontinent, and it is outlined in the periphery by a set of weak neighbors. And for Kautilya, those weak neighbors will naturally hedge their bets between India and China, which they are doing, right? But given the fact that in today's day and age, because of connectedness, because of globalization, because of economic interdependencies, India cannot grow to be a global power unless it has regional security and prosperity. And given also the fact historically that this region, the Indian political subcontinent, has by far been the most prosperous when it has been the most integrated socially and economically, leads us to the fact that we should make this periphery a periphery of Mitras. Right? And this actually feeds into the neighborhood first policy. This actually means positive unilateralism. This also means economic integration, greater soft and hard connectivity projects, etc., etc. But the beauty is that Kautilya says that you should be willing and accepting to the fact that these neighborhood states will be of different nature. So there's someone who can be a permanent ally, someone like Bhutan. There's someone who can be fickle, fickle meaning friendly with you and friendly with another, maybe a Nepal. Indifferent, Udasina, someone who's indifferent to you and the enemy, maybe Myanmar. And feelings of both, could be both inimical and friendly with you at the same time. I'm not sure if Bangladesh fits there, I would hope it does at least. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the whole genre of statecraft that Kautilya professes is extremely nuanced. It works in the shades of grays, and it's very difficult to kind of, one, understand it, and also then to adapt it to the current geopolitical environment. That's all I have for you as part of my presentation. I'll be happy to take questions.
Our next speaker, Mr. Pranav Patel. He's widely recognized as an authority on Kautilya's Arthashastra, which we know is the ancient Indian manuscript on governance, economic policy, and military strategy. He's serving as a program director at the School of Ultimate Leadership. He's the author of Chanakya's Model of Good Governance and will speak today on leadership development and organizational structures. Mr. Patel, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting the Army Commandant, officers, all my teachers. So I don't call them as scholars or colleagues, they're all my teachers. So all my teachers here, and all the friends who are watching online. So really a pleasure to be here. The topic given to me today to speak about, and that too from a Kautilyan perspective, which we've been looking up, is on leadership development, or how to develop a leader. Now, I've been working on this subject, and that is why I work for an institute which is called the School of Ultimate Leadership. It's a school, and that's where I'm going to take you back all to a school level here. Understanding leadership, and in that, the first question which comes a lot of times to me is, are leaders made or leaders born? Right? And a lot of us would have been asking that question all the time. Leaders are made or leaders are born? And Kautilya probably also faced this question, and when he wrote the Arthashastra, he said, let me make a leader born. You know, how can you make a leader born? Right? And in our Shastras, this is a method which has been spoken about, and this is something which I'm going to take you into the Indian scriptures for that matter, and give you a little background from that perspective. And in Kautilya Arthashastra, when we look at, in book number 1.17, so book 1, chapter 17 is where he gets into details of a prince, how to manage a prince, and how to grow a prince, how to train a prince. In fact, Kautilya Arthashastra is a text. I'll go in further. You'll understand where is it taught and when is it taught to a prince, because he is going to be the one who is going to be governing the kingdom. He's going to be the future leader, the one who is going to be running the kingdom for that matter. And in the sutra, if you see what Kautilya says, when the queen is in her ritu, that is a period, priests should offer an charu obligation to Indra and Bruhaspati. Right? So this is not even when the child is conceived. It is in fact even before the child is conceived, when the queen is in her ritu, not yet. And if you understand, after she finishes her period, and after that she is, if you have to put it in the context that she is clean and pure, and that's when the conceiving happens, and you invoke the soul of Indra and Bruhaspati both, as in the guru of the kings and the king of all the devtas whom we talk of. So Indra and Bruhaspati whom we're talking of in that context. That's where, that's low, that's down when we go, because most important when we talk of a plant or a tree is the seeding. Once you have a tree which is grown, fully grown, you cannot change it much. It's time when the seeding happens, that when we have to focus upon, and that's when Kautilya goes in to that level. He says, if I have to develop a future leader for the country, I have to go at the seeding level, where the seeding of the prince is going to happen, and then that's when I have to put in that right, I would say, leadership thought or leadership training which comes into picture. Now, for that matter, he also goes in what happens post. So what he talks about the solar sanskaras. Book number 17, book number 1, chapter 17 is very interesting. In fact, we look at from a perspective of how to take care of a prince who is in disfavor. But he talks of that why should the prince be in disfavor? If you have grown the prince in the right manner, he will not be in disfavor. So he talks of this, and I would say let's focus on the 16 sanskaras which he talks of in that manner, where he goes in fact, prenatal, right? When the conceiving happens the Garbhadhana sanskara. When actually someone comes and figures out that yes, the conceiving has happened, there's a sanskara which happens, that's the right place where the right nurturing starts from. Second, he goes into Punsavana sanskara. This usually happens at the end of the first trimester, the third month, when we talk of the fetus having the soul coming in. In modern day science, when we go to the gynecologist and when you go to the sonography, he'll say, now you see your baby is having heartbeats, right? So the soul has actually got, the life has come into the fetus at that point of time. It is called the Punsavana sanskara, which comes into picture. And usually at the end of the 6th month or the second trimester, which comes in, is coming the Simanto Nayana sanskara, is basically when we call the Srimanta, which we do, and the girl goes to her mother's house where she's been nurtured much better from that perspective. So this happens when the child is still in the mother's womb. Garbha sanskar has been widely spoken about these days. People have been talking about it. The different courses are available in our country where people talk of Garbha sanskara, what to be taught, what to be mothers should be doing at that point of time. And this is where it comes in the prenatal samskaras which we talk of. What happens further is when the child is actually born. And Kautilya calls it the second birth because the first birth happens in the mother's womb and the second birth happens when the child comes out of the mother's womb and actually faces the real world. Right? And that's when all the external energies comes and hits, because till that time the child is in the protection of the womb. And when that energy hits, we also do something called as make the birth chart. Right? The kundali which is made at the time, and that is what we do at that point of time. It's called Jata Karma Sanskara. Post that, in 8 to 10 days, post that, there is something which is called Nama Karma which happens. And then happen is Niskramana Sanskara. A very interesting thing which we look at from Arthashastra, and when we study, we realize what is Niskrama Sanskara. This is the first time the child is moved out of the house. For the first 3 months from when the child is born, the child is only kept inside a dark room with the mother, all right? Listening only to the mother's voice, only mother's touch, only mother's food, which is the taste which is there. Slowly, steadily, one after the other, all the 5 senses are given exposure. Unfortunately, what happens in today's time is the child is suddenly taken into the external environment, which has come out of that protective layer of the mother's womb and hits different kind of senses. Some voice coming from somewhere, sees something from somewhere, so all the senses get confused. So for the sensory organs to rightly develop, for the first 3 months, there's this protection which has been given where the child is kept inside a separate room, and I would say the prince is kept inside a separate room only with the mother who is there, and then brought in, then that sanskara is called the Niskramana sanskara. At the end of the 6 months, is first time he will eat the food, I would say the solid food which we talk of, and that is what is called Annaprasana sanskara. Then comes in the Chudakaran sanskara, which is usually at the end of the first year, where the hair is removed, and finally the ninth sanskara, which is the Karnaveda sanskara, is usually the piercing of the ear. Piercing of the ear has a very scientific understanding which is there, and I'm sure in the armed forces you will have seen a lot of Kshatriyas having the ears pierced from that perspective, and that piercing helps in development of the brain and makes the physical, I would say, development also much better. Kautilya focuses on the next sanskaras which is there, where it starts from is after that, when the child actually at the age of 5 goes and starts studying first. And that's when he starts with the first thing is Vidyarambam sanskara, Vidyarambams. The studies start from here. First education, studying of words and numbers. And that is where Vidyarambam happens. And post Vidyarambam happens the Upanayanam, where the Upanayanam is basically when the adolescent stage starts. And that's when the Janoyu, if we understand from that perspective, is given to the child. And then happens the Vedarambham Sanskara, where the child starts studying the Vedas. Post that happens the Keshanta Sanskara, or I would say the shaving, the first shaving happens. And first shaving, I would say more or less, is when the puberty is hit, is when this Sanskara is done. For girls is when they get the first period, that's when the Keshanta Sanskara or the Rutu Sanskara, which is, it happens at that point of time. Kautilya Arthashastra is taught to the prince at this level. The thought of Arthashastra comes in post the Vedanta. So it is pre-assumed when you start studying Kautilya Arthashastra. Anvikshiki Trayivata Dandaniti Sheti Vidyaha Chatastra Eva Vidya, it is Kautilya. I'll come to that. That's the sutra where it is pre-assumed that the Vedic studies have already happened. So more or less Kautilya Arthashastra, I would say, is more of a graduate level program and not before that, in that sense. Obviously, final that is Samarvartan Sanskara, which is where you finish your education, the prince is ready now to go to the king, so he's leaving the Gurukul and then going to the kingdom in that sense, and then finally also Vivaha Sanskara, he gets married. Obviously, after that, he has kids, so again, Garbhadana Sanskara starts from there. And that so, these are the solar Sanskara. Obviously, I'm not getting into the Anto AST because that's obviously the Antim Sanskara which we talk of from that perspective. But now coming on to the Keshantara Sanskara and post that, where Vidyarambham happens, Kautilya says this in the sutra. He says, a fresh object absorbs whatever is smeared with. Similarly, the prince, immature in intellect, understands as the teaching of the science whatever he is told. Therefore, he should instruct him in what conducive to spiritual and material good, not in what is spiritual and materially harmful. So what teaching needs to be given to the prince at the Vidyarambham Sanskara is the most important from the development of the leader whom we are talking of. Right? And then that's the sutra where Kautilya starts from, and it says, Anvikshiki Trayivata Dandaniti Cheti Vidyaha. Chatastra Eva Vidya. What needs to be the education of the leader? There are 4 sciences. Chatastra Vidya. First one, Anvikshiki. What is Anvikshiki? Which means Sankhya Yoga Lokayata Cha Itya Anvikshiki. Now, Sankhya Yoga Lokayata is one of the 3 philosophies out of the 9 Indian philosophies which we talk of. 3 is the 3 Vedas. Now, this first 2 is assumed that he has already studied. So, in Arthashastra further, he never touches upon these 2. He touches upon the rest 2 when we study the Kautilya Arthashastra further, which is Varta and Dandaniti, which is economics and political science. Excuse me, which is to be taught to the prince at that point of time. So this is where Kautilya Arthashastra begins from, and in the development of the prince. What is it, the most focus, the most important training which needs to be given in that perspective is control over the senses, the 6 enemies which he talks of the leader. When the senses have developed right, that is when I spoke of the sanskara which happens in the first 3 months, the senses have to be developed right, the control over the senses comes in right. And the control over the senses comes in right, he can fight the 6 enemies right. Which are the 6 enemies which we talk of? We all have heard of it somewhere or the other, which is Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Man, Mada, Harsha, which is there. And he says this 6, if he is has to cast out, he has to have something which is called Indriya Jaya. What is Indriya Jaya? Is control over his senses. He talks of the 10 senses, 5 Karmendriya and 5 Jnanendriya. Jnanendriya is in where we get the inputs from. So eyes, ears, nose, tongue, touch, which we said. And Karmendriya is again the tongue which we speak from, hands, limbs, anus and the sexual organs. So that are the 5 Karmendriyas from that perspective. So this 10 is what you focus on from that perspective. He further goes, he says, this is something which he has to still take care of more, emphasizes on this 5. What are these? These are vices. He gives solutions to this also, how to manage these vices in developing the leader or the prince who is there. He says, Parastrishu manaha, longing for the wives of others. Mada kamana, longing for wine. Dhruta kamana, longing for gambling. Mrugaya kamana, longing for hunting. And Patari Vikrama Buddhi is idea of attacking his father himself. All right? If this 5 are there, he is most dangerous. So this 5 in particular, he says, are the vices which needs to be carved out. He gives solutions for that. How do you go about carving them out as well? But I'm not getting into those details. But this is where leadership development comes. That character of the leader which needs to be developed comes in from this. How does this happen? And he says this is, I would say, one of the most important sutra from that perspective. He should have constant association with elders in learning the sake of improving his training, since training has its root in it. Training, doing it again and again and again and again, making that child who's developing as a leader, train in that sciences, in that right perspective, is what we are looking at. Now, going ahead, this is all when we talk of leadership development. We would say, sir, who are going to talk about? We live in the modern world where we need allopathic medicine, we need solutions immediately, right? We can't wait for the child to develop and become into a leader, and then how many years it's going to take? It's going to take a whole generation to go away. Quick solutions kya hai? So Chanakya says quick solutions kuch nahi hai, but then I'll give you qualities. If you're selecting a leader, there are certain qualities which you look at. Selection procedures which we talk of. 4 types of qualities which he focuses upon. First quality which he focuses upon is called abhigamika gunaha, as in his personal qualities which are there. Look at his personal qualities in that sense. There are 60 of them. I have not put all of them here. I have put the selected ones which is there. And from abhigamika gunaka, which he talks of, he says it should come from a noble family. Why from a noble family? So that his upbringing is right. Right? Endowed with good fortune and intelligence, pious and righteous, truthful in speech, resolute mindset, grateful and full of great energies. These are the qualities of his individual self, which he talks about in this sutra, which is called abhigamika gunaha. Then he talks about something called the prajna gunaha, his intelligence, how intelligence is, how focus on that intelligence. In that he talks of his desire to learn, listening, learning and grasping, retention of knowledge, thorough understanding. So there are 5 things which he put up, and I would say let's read this again and in sequence, understand what he's saying. First, he should have the desire to learn something. Learn something, but how? He should be able to listen something, not hear, listening. Then we talk of learning and grasping. So whatever he has heard or he's listening to, is he grasping it right? And after grasping it, is he retaining it? So we talk of the dharana, which is basically retention of that knowledge which is there. When the knowledge is retained, it gets converted into his own science or his own art, which he's supposed to have mastered upon. And that's when the vijnanam comes in, or thorough understanding of that knowledge which is focused upon. Next sutra he focuses upon is utsaha gunaha. Right? So this is the 3rd quality which we're talking of, the utsaha gunaha. Utsaha gunaha is how enthusiastic he is. So in that he comes in bravery, resentment against injustice, quickness, and then dexterity. So these are things in terms of how quick he is. You don't want a leader to be lazy, who's okay, ho raha hai, chal raha hai. Right? You want the leader to be upright and fast and quick and be alert in that sense. So this is the gunas which he focuses upon that. Next, in the last week, gunas which he talks about is Atma Sampanna. Now, this is something which is, I would say, something which can be acquired. And this is what the West, I would say, somewhere or the other focuses upon. Because Indian leadership principles, when we focus upon it, always talks about the internal qualities of the person. West focuses more on the external. And what are these external things which we talk of? Eloquent speaker. Can he speak? Yes, this can be gained. Next, strong memory and intellect. Train in all kinds of arts and skills. Free from vices, visionary, seeing far into the future, and prioritizing action based on place, time, people, and tasks. These are skills which can be acquired. So does he have those required skills from that perspective? These are qualities which we focus upon from a leader's perspective, whom we're looking at in terms of leadership selection. But I would say, as Chanakya would have done, he would have actually want to develop the right leader, because we're looking at leadership development, and the development happens from the right seeding to coming out to that right tree or the plant which we're looking at from the perspective of the leader who is there. Finally, he says what kind of a rishi or what kind of a leader we should have, and he uses the word which is called Raja Rishi. Saintly leader, a leader, saint-like leader from that perspective. And what he says in the sutra, where he focuses, he says, therefore, by casting out the group of 6 enemies, he should acquire control over the senses, cultivate his intellect by association with elders, keep a warm, watchful eye by means of spies, bring about security and well-being of energetic activities, maintain the observance of their special duties by the subjects, by carrying out his own duties, acquiring discipline by receiving instruction in science, attain popularity by association with what is material advantage, and maintain proper behavior by doing what is beneficial. This is a whole sutra in terms of, he says, how a leader should be. So this is the end goal which we have to achieve, but then development happens through the phase which we talk of, and I would say it's just not an overnight process. Leadership development does take generations to come out with the right leader from that perspective, and Kautilya focuses from that. Finally, the leader's quality which we eventually need to develop. Praja sukhe sukham rajaha, prajanam ta hite hitam, natma priyam hitam raja, prajanam ta priyam. So in the benefit of the subjects lies the benefit of the king, and in what is beneficial to the subject is his own benefit. What is dear to himself is not beneficial to the king, but what is dear to the subject is beneficial to him. You know, everything is for the people, not for myself. I, me, myself is not a leader. In fact, that is a hero. So Kautilya focuses on two words which alarms here in this sutra which we talk of is sukha and hita. Right? Sukhakari and hitakari. You know, प्रजा का सुख देखना है या प्रजा का हित देखना है, right? So प्रजा का sukha is basically happiness and hita is in terms of benefit. In that, benefit has to always take priority over sukha. At times there might be some steps which the leaders might have to take which might not be sukhakari, but they are hitakari. Right? There's some, I would say in our country we had demonetization. Today we are the world's largest digital economy for that perspective. So hitakari over sukhakari is what needs to be focused upon from that perspective is what this is. So this is more or less is the focus on leadership development and what a leader should be. So I thought I'll just focus in that journey of leadership development and the qualities of the leader that we look at. Second part is what I am going to what I'm asked to speak about is the Saptanga, the 7 pillars of leadership which we both the earlier speakers spoke about, and the sutra which it covers is basically in book number 6 where it says Swami Amatya Janapada Durga Kosha Danda Mitrani Prakriteyaha. Right? Swami as in the king, the minister, the country, the fortified city, the treasury, the army and the ally are the constituent elements of the state. What are these things which we talk of here? This is in structure. In fact, book number 6, if we study the Kautilya Arthashastra, till book number 6, it is all internal. From book number 1, focuses on the leader himself, development of the leader, development of his people around. Book number 2 starts with how to develop a village and then go on to developing a whole state from that perspective and reaches to the level where he talks of developing law and order to run the state, going into judicial system, then controlling internal conflicts which is there in terms of internal securities, and then finally the spying system to know the systems around. At that end, he says, now here the state is ready. And he gives an outside-in view of the state where this sutra comes in book number 6. Post that is all outside. So all the foreign policy comes in post book 6 where it is external. So the end of internal and starting of external comes in with this sutra which is there. Where he talks of is this. So what is it? The Swami, as in the leader, it's a structure, I would say a thinking model which he gives from that perspective. The leader, the Swami, the Amatya, as in the manager or the minister, I would say from that perspective. Janapada, as in the country, the people. Durga, as in the infrastructure which is there. Kosha, the treasury. Danda, the army. And Mitra, as in the ally. These are the 7 constituent elements of a state. If we cover the 7, it actually takes you across the state from that perspective. You know, and this is, in fact, in the sutra, if we go back, he says, Iti prakrite, mitrani prakriteyaha. It is nature. This is law of nature from that perspective. And when we have to put it in that sense of nature, we can look at any organizational structure having these 7 elements which will cover the whole organization. Now we can put a country in this perspective, we can put a business organization in this perspective, we can put an academic institute in this perspective, we can put any kind of an organization. So an organizational structure which we focus upon is basically this sutra which gives us Swami, Amatya, Janapad, Durga, Kosha, Danda and Mitra. There are the 7 elements from that perspective. So, thank you very much. That's about it from my side, and any questions, we'll take it later. Thank you.
The final speaker of the seminar, Professor Upender Singh, is a professor of history at Ashoka University. She's written and edited over 15 books, and her research has been published in leading national and international journals. She's written on a wide spectrum of aspects of ancient Indian history and archaeology. Her work includes portraits of Power Ashoka and Kautilya. I now invite Professor Upender Singh to speak on Arthashastra, the limits of power and force, and its relevance to modern military warfare. Professor Upender Singh.
Thank you very much. This is not moving? Yeah, it is the right. I was pressing this.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. General Malik, distinguished generals serving and retired, officers and soldiers of the Indian Army, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Gyan Chakra think tank, especially Lieutenant General Katyar and Major General Bali, for inviting me to participate in the Chanakya dialogues. The Arthashastra is a famous text, a notorious text, a much misunderstood text. I would like to address some popular myths or misconceptions about it while highlighting some of its complexity and its important ideas related to political power, force, and war. I will also try to highlight its achievements and its contemporary relevance. There are 4 widely prevalent misconceptions or myths about the Arthashastra. That it was written by a man named Chanakya, that it describes Chandragupta Maurya's administration, that Kautilya's ideal state is totalitarian, its king is an authoritarian despot, and that it prescribes an unbridled use of force and violence for political gain. So let's take the first myth, that the Arthashastra was written by Chanakya. This is the traditional popular view, that it was written by a man named Kautilya, alias Chanakya, alias Vishnugupta, in the 4th century BC, and that this was the man who became the chief minister of Chandragupta Maurya, helping him overthrow the Nanda dynasty. Some historians, some scholars still hold this view. The current mainstream historians' view is that it was composed after the Mauryan period, between the 2nd, 1st century BC and the 2nd, 3rd century AD, and that there were several scholars who contributed to the writing of this book. One of these many scholars, authors, was Kautilya. According to this view, the connection between Kautilya and Chanakya happened many centuries later, during the Gupta period and after the Gupta period. I think at the very least, when we talk about Kautilya, Chanakya, we need to interrogate the connection. We need to question it. The many anthologies of political and ethical maxims and sayings that are attributed to Chanakya are much later. They should not be confused or mixed up with the Arthashastra. Let's move to the second myth, that the Arthashastra describes Chandragupta Maurya's administration. There is not a single reference in the text to the Mauryas, to Pataliputra, to Chandragupta. This is not a description of the Mauryan state. It is a description of a potential state. I see the Arthashastra as a brilliant, highly influential work on statecraft, in fact, on political economy. It is a sophisticated theoretical work rooted in the practice of politics. It presents a very meticulous and logical treatment of statecraft based on reason. And its audience, it tells us itself, are kings, and also I would include high-ranking officials. A lot of the misunderstanding of the Arthashastra is based on a misunderstanding of its perspective. What is its perspective? Dharma is mentioned occasionally in the Arthashastra. In fact, the text has a Brahminical perspective on dharma. It accepts the idea of the 4 varnas, Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, and their duties and roles in society. But Kautilya has no compunctions in breaking with Brahminical dharma, any kind of dharma norms, when the state's interests are involved. He says, Artha eva pradhana. Artha is supreme, says Kautilya, because dharma and kama are dependent on it. So this is a text in which the interests and profits of the state are paramount. Dharma is not important, it is artha that is important. So how did a text which is about artha become a text on politics or statecraft? And Kautilya tells us, the Artha Shastra says, artha, this is how he defines artha, and this is how he defines Artha Shastra. He says, artha is the livelihood of men, that is, the earth inhabited by men. The Shastra, which is the means of the acquisition and protection of the earth, that is Artha Shastra. And because it is rulers who acquire and protect the earth, Artha Shastra is the science of politics and statecraft. Let's go to the third myth or misconception, that Kautilya's ideal state is totalitarian, that its ruler is an authoritarian despot without any checks. At first glance, this may seem to be the case. For instance, the Arthashastra in one place says, the king and his rule, that is the essence of the prakritis, the constituent elements of the state. If you read the Arthashastra, one of the very striking aspects of the text is the stringent and complete control and regulation that it advocates over all aspects of social and economic life. Kautilya's state is an entrepreneur in agriculture, in manufacturing, and in fact, the entire treatment of the economy in the Arthashastra would put, I think, Soviet Russia to shame, because it's complete, comprehensive, tight control of all aspects of the economy by the state. It's also a very intrusive surveillance state, and Kautilya has a huge amount of discussion on spies, secret agents in various kinds of disguise who are supposed to fan out to different parts of the empire and snoop and inform the king and his officers what people are up to. So at first glance, it seems that Kautilya's ideal state is indeed a totalitarian state. An authoritarian despot is what the king is. There are other places, however, where we get a different picture. We see, for instance, that, and the previous speakers talked about this, he emphasizes the education of the ruler, the training of the ruler. Self-control or vinaya is very, very important as far as rulers are concerned, the ideal rulers, and they must also, according to Kautilya, listen to advice. Quote, from the self-controlled king who is trained in the branches of knowledge and is intent on training his subjects, enjoys unshared lordship over the earth, devoted to the welfare of all beings. Sarva bhuta hite rataha. This is something that he says. And then he also says, kingship can be carried out only with the help of associates. One wheel alone cannot turn a cart or chariot. So the king should appoint advisors and listen to their opinion. Occasionally, Kautilya does make pious statements. He talks about how in the happiness of his subjects lies the happiness of the king. This was cited by the previous speaker. And in his welfare lies the welfare of his subjects. The king's welfare does not lie in what is pleasing to himself, but his welfare lies in what is pleasing to his subjects. In my view, Kautilya's brilliant intervention is that it goes beyond pious statements. It goes beyond invoking dharma. Kautilya demonstrates that it is in the king's self-interest to promote the welfare of his people, and that is his brilliant intervention. He also warns rulers against excessive taxation and exploitation of subjects. As from a garden, he should pluck fruits from the kingdom as they ripen, not before. He should avoid plucking unripe fruits that leads to rebellion out of fear of his own destruction. And interestingly, there are several references in the Arthashastra to Prakriti Kopa, the anger of the people. And the ruler is warned, don't overdo it, don't overexploit, otherwise you will have to face the anger of the people. In fact, although the Arthashastra is often seen as a supporter of totalitarian rule, I see the king of the Arthashastra as a very vulnerable figure. And in fact, he is really underlying simultaneously not only the power of the king, but also the fragility of power. And this comes out in the constant danger of violence against the king that the Arthashastra talks about. Quote, a king can only protect his kingdom when he is himself protected from those close to him and from his enemies, first of all, from his wives and sons. So Kautilya's king has to be ever vigilant. He has to change his bed every night because there are assassins of all kinds out to get him, starting with his women and his sons. Those are the most dangerous. And he has to constantly guard himself against poisoners and assassins. There's a lot of discussion in the Arthashastra about poison. So this is not a confident, secure king. I think the king of the Arthashastra is a king who is also constantly having to be vigilant and fearful for his life. The fourth myth, that the Arthashastra prescribes an unbridled use of force and violence, and at first glance it might seem to be the case. After all, the Arthashastra does say that the ends justify the means, and the king must deal with internal and external enemies ruthlessly. He must kill before he is killed. He talks about open and secret killing, assassination. These are all parts of the game, and the king should not be squeamish or reluctant to engage in these actions. In the administration of justice, and there's a very detailed discussion of that in the Arthashastra, he talks about how inflicting pain, torture, mutilation, amputation, these are considered routine parts of punishment. Different types of torture are discussed. Of course, these types of tortures would put modern torture methods to shame, but he does talk about striking, whipping, caning, suspension from a rope, inserting needles under the nails, and the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is also recommended and applied in certain cases. What I would like to say and emphasize is that Kautilya advocates the ruthless use of force. Yes. Excessive, wanton use of force? No. This is clear from the following. Some of this has been touched on by the earlier speakers. He talks about the three Shaktis or powers of a ruler. Mantra Shakti, the power of counsel, that is listening to good advice. Prabhu Shakti, the power of lordship, that is military might. And the power of energy, Utsaha Shakti. And he says, and he goes against the views of other experts in saying so, he says that the power of counsel, that is listening to good advice, Mantra Shakti, is supreme. Another important instance, also spoken of by an earlier speaker, he talks about the upayas or expedients, sama, dana, danda, bheda. But in his discussion, he does emphasize that force must be a last resort. It must be very carefully calibrated. It must be judiciously used after careful thought and application of a meticulous cost-benefit analysis. Using unnecessary or excessive force, according to Kautilya, is counterproductive and is dangerous for rulers. So he's against unnecessary or excessive force. And since I'm talking to an audience of army officers, I must say something about war. The three kinds of war that he talks about: open war or prakasha yudh, when the enemy enemies engage at a designated time and place on a battlefield. The second kind of war is Koot Yudh, crooked war, where you create fright, sudden assault, striking when the enemy is in difficulty or calamity, guerrilla warfare, you might call it. And then you also have silent war, Tushnim Yudh. This involves using trickery, magic, and occult practices. So he's very rational, but he does believe in magic and occult practices. And he advocates the use of these things in military operations as well. And he is also aware of the importance of mantra yudh, or diplomatic war. When it comes to the types of victors, surprisingly, because dharma is not important for him, surprisingly here, this is one place where you do get a glimmer of importance attached to dharma. He says that there is the righteous victor, dharma vijayi, who is satisfied with submission. There is the lobha vijayi, which is the ruler's, the greedy victor who wants to seize land and goods of the enemy. And then there is the worst kind of victor, the asura vijayi, who is the demonic victor who is only satisfied with the seizure of goods, lands, sons, wives, and the lives of the enemy. So clearly there's some kind of moral angle coming in here, but it's not really overall important, because what is of great importance, paramount importance to Kautilya, is to win at any cost. So war is a natural part of politics for him, but he also warns of the dangers of war. He talks about how war must be treated as a last resort, and he advocates the use of various means. Apart from direct military engagement, he advocates achieving the aims of war through other means. Now, one of the aspects of Kautilya's Arthashastra is that it's seen as a text that advocates extreme cruelty in politics. Ahimsa, or nonviolence, is not central to the text, but Kautilya does mention it. He talks about duties common to all, and this is part of the Samanya Dharma. And among these Samanya Dharma qualities or kind of duties are ahimsa, that is non-violence, and anrishamsya, that is non-cruelty. He also says that the king must have his senses under control. He is, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, the ideal of the Raja Rishi, somebody who is both a Raja as well as a Rishi. This is mentioned by Kautilya. And Kautilya also, by the way, discusses physical injury, not only to humans, but as well as plants and animals. And in fact, what is interesting is that on non-violence towards animals, Kautilya, in fact, outdoes Ashoka, although there is a crucial difference in emphasis on non-violence and also on the rationale for non-violence. So I'm going to give you my conclusions. If the slide moves forward, yes. I hope I have dispelled several misconceptions or myths about the Arthashastra. The idea that the Arthashastra was written by Kautilya or by Chanakya, I mean, this is something that has to be interrogated. It was written by someone named Kautilya, who is mentioned again and again and again in the text. And it was also written by several others. It's not just a one-author book. Many centuries later, Kautilya came to be identified with Chanakya of the Chanakya Chandragupta part of the story. The Arthashastra does not describe Chandragupta Maurya's administration. It describes a potential state, a state which never existed, and I hope never exists, and I'll tell you why. Its ideal king is very powerful, but not a totalitarian despot. There are some checks, and the main check is self-interest. Don't go too far, otherwise you will pay for it. That is the basic check. Rulers must use all necessary force under or against internal and external enemies, but excessive, wanton violence is useless, according to Kautilya, and it is counterproductive. And he urges that war should be a last resort. What about the contemporary relevance of Kautilya's ideas and recommendations? There's plenty there that we can find relevant. For instance, Kautilya's insistence that rulers must be well educated and trained, they must have control over their senses, they must listen to good advice, they must use logic and reason, they must do a careful cost-benefit analysis before they act. Who would disagree with any of this? It's applicable to all times and all places. Kautilya's point that it is in rulers' self-interest to promote the prosperity of subjects, that is also valid for our times. His warning that exploitative, cruel, and unjust rulers risk meeting their nemesis due to the anger of the people, I think it's more applicable to democracies than it is to Kautilya's own time. He has a point there. When he says that excessive use of force against subjects and enemies is counterproductive and dangerous to rulers themselves, that is a warning that is worth heeding even today. And today, as we live in a world where there are so many theaters of wars, of devastating wars, I think we would agree, and I think all of you, this audience would always agree that war must always be a last resort. So these are some of the important points that are recommendations and ideas that are there in the Arthashastra, which are valid for our own time. However, even if we accept that Kautilya does not fully deserve the notoriety that he has acquired, even if we say he is much misunderstood, we should not go to the other extreme. We must not forget, and we should not get carried away, we must not forget that the Arthashastra was written for ancient monarchies, not for modern democracies. It was written for ancient kings and their advisors, not for us, not for people sitting here in this room. It presents a model of an extremely intrusive surveillance state where subjects are constantly being spied on by secret agents in various kinds of a bewildering range of disguises. I think we would be very uncomfortable with that. Kautilya recommends Upanshu Danda, secret killing. And this secret killing, according to him, it does not only necessarily apply to enemies, even subjects, officials, others, anybody who the king feels is acting, behaving in a suspicious way, or doing something that is detrimental to the ruler's interest, kill him. Kautilya has no problem with that kind of advice. I think we would be uncomfortable with that. That's why I said I think all of us would really hate to live in a Kautilyan state, because let us not forget all this. He accepts torture and very cruel punishments, and of course he does accept the death penalty also. This is a text that accepts inequality. It takes inequality for granted. It accepts class, caste, and gender inequality. The Brahman for Kautilya is at the top, and the untouchable is at the bottom of the social ladder. Women are subordinate to men, no question. So the ideals of equality and freedom, which are so central to our constitution, are completely absent in the Arthashastra. Its picture of interstate relations, of course, you very persuasively argued otherwise, but I was wondering whether that discussion of interstate relations, which is basically based on small or moderate-sized states, of course the idea of empire is there, but the Rajamandala theory is talking about a congeries of small or medium-sized states. I don't know whether this is in tune with contemporary post-nuclear, post-Trump global geopolitics. The idea that geographical location of a state determines whether he is your enemy or ally or whatever. But of course, Kautilya, being a mastermind and being a brilliant thinker, does say, as we were told, that he also says friends and can become enemies and enemies can become allies. The whole Rajamandala can turn topsy-turvy in an instant. And finally, that's the last question that I will leave you with. Do we really want a politics where ends justify the means, where rulers act only in their interest, and where morality does not count? Because that, and we must understand this point very clearly without romanticizing the text, that is the essence of the discipline of Arthashastra. Politics divorced from morality. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me.
I now invite Major General Neeraj Pali to moderate the question answer session and sum up the seminar.
As it must happen in every seminar, we are behind time.